Umbrella's Arklay operations were on track to create what they thought was going to be their most advanced biological weapon, the TVirus. But instead of their research being destroyed by outside intervention, it ended up being sabotaged from within by one of their own. Because when a corporation builds its foundation on betrayal, secrecy, and human experimentation, it's only a matter of time before those same decisions turn against it. In the previous episode, we explored Umbrella's hidden Arklay labs, facilities built deep within the mountains to refine the TVirus and develop more and more dangerous bioweapons. For decades, these operations remained completely hidden, controlled, and isolated. Until they weren't. The downfall of the Arklay facilities started with the betrayal of Dr. James Marcus, one of Umbrella's founding researchers, who was killed on the orders of Oswell E. Spencer, the very man he helped build the company with. Years later, he took revenge in a way Umbrella never anticipated, leading to the release of the TVirus across the Arklay research network and the collapse of the Spencer Mansion incident. What happened to be an isolated disaster in the mountains was never truly contained, because the virus didn't remain in the Arklay Mountains. It spread, quietly, indirectly, and long before the public ever realized what was happening. Which raises the real question, how did the virus truly enter the city? Who was responsible for its spread? What was the exact chain of events that transformed a functioning city into ground zero of one of the worst biological disasters in history? And contrary to what most people think, Umbrella didn't fall immediately after Raccoon City's destruction. The company survived for years, operating in the shadows, suppressing evidence, and trying to contain the global consequences of the outbreak they created. So what really happened between the fall of Raccoon City and the eventual downfall of Umbrella itself? What did they secretly leave behind years after their operations were officially finished? When the Spencer Mansion was destroyed in late July 1998, Umbrella's Arklay research facilities were effectively wiped out, and much of the physical evidence of their illegal experiments was erased. However, the effects of what had been released there didn't end with the explosion, as TVirus contamination had already spread beyond the isolated Arklay Mountains. After being extracted, the surviving S.T.A.R.S members returned to Raccoon City and formally reported everything they had witnessed in the Arklay Mountains, including the bioweapon experiments, the viral outbreak, infected organisms, experimental creatures, and Umbrella's concealed pharmaceutical research network. Despite the severity of these testimonies, no full investigation was launched. Instead, the reports were suppressed within the Raccoon Police Department. Chief Brian Irons, who had covert financial ties to Umbrella, dismissed the incident as an isolated event and claimed the officers were psychologically affected by extreme stress. Official records were downplayed, and any formal attempt to pursue Umbrella was quietly blocked, effectively discrediting and neutralizing the only law enforcement unit with direct knowledge of the Arklay incident without formally disbanding it. This response aligned with Umbrella's deep influence over Raccoon City, where the company funded major infrastructure, hospitals, and public services, and employed a large portion of the population either directly or indirectly, creating economic dependence that reduced public scrutiny and institutional resistance. At the same time, Umbrella's research was never limited to the mountains. One of Umbrella's most important research sites was built directly beneath Raccoon City itself, the NEST laboratory. Unlike the Arklay facilities, which focused on TVirus experimentation and field testing, NEST functioned as a highly advanced underground research center dedicated to controlled viral development. It was here that Dr. William Birkin, one of Umbrella's best virologists and a former prodigy of James Marcus, was leading the development of a new strain known as the G virus. Unlike the T-virus, which was designed for mass bioweapon production, the G virus was a far more experimental project, focused on extreme mutation, adaptive regeneration, and long-term evolutionary potential. Because of its importance, NEST was constructed as a large-scale self-contained laboratory complex, connected to the city's sewer and infrastructure systems, allowing Umbrella to conduct high-level research in secrecy while maintaining operations directly beneath an active urban environment. Even after the Arklay incident, the underground NEST lab remained fully operational, continuing its work uninterrupted, while the official narrative claimed the Arklay disaster had been contained. Meanwhile, contamination linked to the Arklay outbreak began appearing gradually rather than as an immediate citywide disaster. By early August, medical reports in Raccoon City were already documenting unusual symptoms such as tissue necrosis, cognitive instability, and sudden aggressive behavior, which were misdiagnosed or recorded as rare medical anomalies rather than viral infections. The contamination likely spread indirectly through environmental and infrastructural pathways, as wildlife and water sources in the Arklay region have been exposed to the TVirus during the laboratory collapse, allowing trace viral presence to move downstream into areas connected to the city's ecosystem and create a slow, largely unnoticed seepage instead of an immediate urban outbreak. By mid-August, informal reports emerged describing abnormal animal behavior and sightings of unidentified hostile creatures around the outskirts of Raccoon City. But these never triggered large-scale emergency response and reinforced the belief that the Arklay incident remained isolated. Internally, Umbrella relied on information control, restricting records, stalling investigations, and using corporate influence to shape the official response. While Dr. William Birkin, whose GVirus research was nearing completion, remained in contact with Chief Brian Irons and provided financial incentives to prevent the police from interfering. During this period, pressure on Umbrella's underground facilities increased due to their growing suspicion and disturbances within the sewer network connected to their research infrastructure. Some underground operations were temporarily scaled back to avoid attention, but core research inside Nest continued without interruption. At the same time, Chris Redfield began his own independent investigation after the Arklay case was suppressed and concluded that Umbrella's bioweapon research extended far beyond the destroyed mountain laboratories. With institutional resistance inside Raccoon City and no official cooperation, he left for Europe in late August to continue investigating Umbrella's global operations. By the end of the month, Raccoon City didn't see any form of decline yet, but the underlying conditions had already changed. Unusual illnesses were spreading, environmental exposure was increasing, investigations were being suppressed, and Umbrella's underground research facilities remained active. Over time, Birkin's relationship with Umbrella's leadership began to worsen. As the GVirus was getting closer to completion, Birkin became more and more protective, secretive, and resistant to corporate oversight, treating the project as his life's work rather than a company asset. Internal concerns within Umbrella grew after the Arklay incident, which had already demonstrated the dangers of losing control over experimental research. Reports suggested that Birkin was restricting access to data, closely guarding virus samples, and showing signs of acting independently of corporate command. Umbrella's intelligence indicated that he was exploring the strategic value of the GVirus beyond Umbrella's internal structure, including potential interest from external military channels, raising fears that the company could lose exclusive control over one of its most valuable bioweapon assets. To Umbrella's executives, this was a massive corporate risk. The GVirus represented years of proprietary research, and allowing a single scientist to retain operational control over its samples and data created the possibility of defection, withholding of research, or unauthorized transfer. Rather than risk losing ownership of the virus, Umbrella headquarters made a calculated decision to suspend the GVirus project, remove Birkin from his position, and directly seize all research materials stored within Nest. On September 23, 1998, the Umbrella Security Service, including an elite recovery unit led by Hunk, was deployed to infiltrate the underground facility, confiscate the GVirus samples, and secure all related research data. The operation was structured as a retrieval mission, not a negotiation, intended to reassert corporate control over both the asset and the researcher. Birkin quickly realized the purpose of the operation. As USS operatives moved through Nest to secure the virus, he attempted to protect the samples and his research. The confrontation escalated, and during the seizure attempt, Birkin was shot and critically wounded by the recovery team as they proceeded with the confiscation order. Facing the loss of both his research and his life, Birkin made a final decision. In a desperate act, he injected himself with the GVirus. The virus immediately began reconstructing his body at a cellular level, triggering a rapid and irreversible mutation process that transformed him into a G organism. Emergency systems within Nest registered a major biohazard event as containment protocols began to fail in real time. The mutated Birkin followed the USS team and attacked them inside the sewers right beneath the lab, wiping out the recovery team during the containment breach. During the chaos, TVirus samples that were retrieved alongside the GVirus samples by the USS were damaged and released into the surrounding environment of the facility. Because S.T.A.R.S was directly integrated into Raccoon City's sewer and underground runoff systems, the contamination didn't remain confined to the lab. Viral material entered the underground ecosystem, where infected rodents and environmental pathways carried the virus beyond the facility and into the city's wider infrastructure. The Arclay contamination had spread gradually through environmental seepage, but the GVirus incident created a direct biological release beneath an active urban population. With the primary containment site compromised, the lead researcher mutated, and viral samples now circulating through the sewer network, the outbreak had now become inevitable. After the mess under Nest, the virus started leaking into the systems that kept the city running. Down in the sewers, rats ate viral samples that had spilled into the tunnels, becoming the first big carriers. Since they were always moving through the waste and water pipes, the underground became a perfect delivery system. As things got worse underground, the infected rats were pushed out of their nests and into the city's main water supply. Eventually, the drinking water and the water people used for washing became contaminated. People didn't even have to get bitten anymore. They could get sick by just using their sink. This was made even worse because the city's trash and waste systems were already struggling to handle all the biohazard junk Umbrella was pushing out. A huge part of the problem was the P12A incinerator, the plant that handled Umbrella's chemical waste. By 1998, they had way more waste than they could handle, and their cleaning systems couldn't keep up. Contaminated waste started leaking into the soil and groundwater weeks before the main outbreak, slowly and quietly poisoning the environment. The first real red flags came up at Raccoon General Hospital. By mid-September, people were coming in with weird symptoms like skin sores and mental degradation. Doctors didn't know what they were looking at, so they misdiagnosed them as rare illnesses. Because no one realized it was a virus, infected patients were kept in regular rooms with everyone else. This allowed the infection to spread through the hospital staff and other patients, turning the hospital into a ticking time bomb. Before the public started to panic, people were already dying in strange ways. Workers who handled the city's water and sewage were the first to get hit, showing signs of physical decay and mental breakdowns. Animals around the edge of the town started acting crazy and weird. But even with all these clues, everything stayed quiet. Local news downplayed the weird sightings and medical cases, mostly because Umbrella was leaning on them to keep them silent. On the surface, Raccoon City looked fine, but its water, its hospitals, and its nature were already decaying from the inside out. One night in late September, everything hit the fan. All those small infections that had been hiding under the surface finally exploded. People started losing it in public, attacking others out of nowhere. It got so bad that people started calling it the cannibal disease. The police thought they were heading to riots or drug calls, but they were completely wrong. They were caught off guard and overwhelmed almost instantly because they had no idea what they were actually even fighting. One of the first big incidents happened at Jay's bar. It was a normal night until an infected guy started attacking people inside. Survivors like Kevin Ryman and Mark Wilkins were some of the first to see the truth, that this wasn't just a crime and it wasn't a one-off thing. It was happening everywhere. Everything was falling apart. There was no evacuation plan, no army to help, and no word from the government. Fires started popping up all over the place as the city's infrastructure failed. To make things weirder, the virus didn't infect everyone the same. Some people were mutating into monsters that didn't even look human anymore. Things way more aggressive than the normal zombies. Even while the city burned, the news was still calling it riots or accidents. Nobody mentioned a virus, so people didn't know exactly how to react. There was just confusion and denial until it was way too late to fix it. By the time people realized how bad it was, the infection was everywhere. It wasn't just humans either. Over at the Raccoon City Zoo, infected animals broke out of their cages, turning the local wildlife into a nightmare. The virus had officially moved into the entire ecosystem. The tunnels under the city weren't safe anymore either. Anyone trying to escape through the sewers found out the hard way that the pipes were now breeding grounds for even weirder monsters. The virus was spreading and evolving at the same time, turning into different, scarier versions of itself. One by one, the city's big buildings failed. Raccoon General Hospital was one of the first to go. Patients started turning into zombies right in their beds, attacking the doctors and nurses until the whole place was a graveyard. The police station was also losing the fight. They were running out of bullets, their barricades were breaking, and no one was in charge anymore. The police stopped trying to save the city and just tried to stay alive. By this point, nowhere was safe. Not the streets, not the buildings, and not even the sewers. The infection had taken over everything, and there was no way to stop it. At this stage, Umbrella knew the virus was totally out of control, so they stopped trying to fix the mess and started focusing on covering their tracks. The S.T.A.R.S members who made it out of the Spencer mansion months ago were now Umbrella's biggest problem. They knew way too much, and if they talked, the company was finished. So instead of trying to save the city, Umbrella decided to wipe out anyone who could ever link the disaster back to them. To get the job done, they deployed their newest bioweapon, Nemesis. Unlike the other tyrants, Nemesis was an unfinished prototype. It was programmed specifically to find and kill every last S.T.A.R.S member. It was way more focused and persistent than anything Umbrella had made before, making it incredibly dangerous. Jill Valentine, one of the S.T.A.R.S survivors, became its main target. As the city fell apart, she now had to run from zombies and something that was designed specifically to find her. Around this time, Umbrella also sent in the UBCS. On paper, they were a rescue team there to save civilians, but Umbrella saw them as completely replaceable. The company was just using them to see how their bioweapons performed in a live environment, basically using both the zombies and their own soldiers as lab rats in a giant field test. By the time anyone from outside showed up, the outbreak was basically over. LeonKennedy rolled into town for his first day as a police officer, and Claire Redfield arrived looking for her brother, not knowing he'd actually left weeks ago to investigate Umbrella. Neither of them had any clue what they were walking into. By the time they reached the edge of the town, it was already too late to get ready for anything because the city they expected to find was just gone. The streets were either totally empty or crawling with monsters, and whole neighborhoods were on fire. Any official help was long gone. The few people left were either hiding, hurt, or desperately trying to get out. They both headed for the Raccoon City Police Department, but even the station had already been trashed. Inside, the police were barely hanging on. There was no way to call for help, no one was in charge anymore, and they had officially already lost the fight. Leon and Claire showed up after the city had already fallen apart. Inside the RPD, any sense of order was totally gone. The station was supposed to be the place where the city's rescue was planned, but it was just one of the last places left standing. They tried to block off the hallways and doors, but every move they made to secure the building was really just stalling for time. And the zombies weren't the only thing they had to worry about inside. Umbrella had started dropping more bioweapons into the city to kill witnesses, and Grappa was left to their research. They sent many T-103 tyrants, and one of them right into the police station. Unlike the random chaos outside, this thing was focused, chasing down anyone who knew too much, and to retrieve Umbrella's important research assets. As survivors moved past the police station and deeper underground, they started finding parts of Raccoon City that were supposed to stay secret. Places like Nest, where the whole nightmare actually began. Inside these labs, they could clearly see what Umbrella had been doing. It was the result of planned research, testing on humans, and building bioweapons to be sold and used. The outbreak in the streets was just the end result of what they were doing down there. For anyone who made it to these labs, the infection finally made sense. The deeper the survivors went, the more they realized that everything happening on the surface was created right here first. For people like Yoko Suzuki, this was more like proof rather than a new discovery. Since she used to work for Umbrella, she already knew the company was involved in some dark stuff. These labs showed exactly how much they had been hiding and how long they had been getting away with it. By the time the truth finally came out, people were already trying to stop the virus, but it was way too little, way too late. Inside what was left of the city's hospitals and labs, some people were still looking for a cure. Dr. Nathaniel Bard, one of the few Umbrella scientists left in town, had been working on a vaccine to fight the TVirus. His research was pretty much the last real hope for stopping the spread. At the same time, the stakes had also gotten personal. Sherry Birkin had been infected with the G-virus by her own father, making her one of the few people who actually stood a chance at being saved. Even though the mutation was scary, they managed to use a vaccine to stabilize her, which showed that in the right situation, a cure could actually work. But these small wins didn't change the big picture. The outbreak was just too big for any cure to fix in time. The virus was in the whole population, the buildings, and the water. Even with a working vaccine, there was no way to get it to everyone. There was nothing left in Raccoon City worth saving. After finding out the truth about Umbrella's labs and surviving the nightmare underground, Leon and Claire managed to get out of the city with Sherry. What started as a small problem had turned into something way too big to handle. There was no way to lock it down or fix anything, and the government was terrified that the virus would leak out and spread across the entire country. For them, the math was simple. If the virus got out, it wouldn't be just one city in trouble. It would be the end of the world. So they made a choice. Raccoon City had to be wiped off the map. A missile strike was authorized, claiming it was the only way to stop the biological threat. But secretly, it was also a way to make sure everything, the evidence, the victims, the truth, disappeared forever. On October 1st, 1998, they pulled the trigger. The missile had been launched and was now hours away from reaching the city. Jill's fight had finally reached its end. She finally took down Nemesis, stopping Umbrella's attempt to kill her. With help from a few surviving UBCS soldiers, she found a way out just before the city was totally cut off. These escapes weren't exactly victories, they were just lucky. For every person who made it out, thousands more were left behind. The survivors took with them bits of the truth and proof of what Umbrella had done. In an instant, the city was vaporized, and over 100,000 people were killed. No survivors, no records of what happened, and no proof of the monsters Umbrella had built there. But the truth wasn't completely wiped out. The few people that had already made it out had seen everything. After the explosion, the Raccoon City outbreak went quiet. Overnight, a sprawling American city was scrubbed from the map along with over 100,000 people. There was no organized evacuation, no early warning, and certainly no official explanation. For the rest of the world, there was just a big, scary radio silence. And that silence was a weapon. The US government desperately moved to control the story. The official line was a local viral disaster, a tragic one-off failure of containment that required a drastic solution. They buried the truth of the TVirus under the guise of national security, but the real secret was the government's own role in this disaster. The White House hadn't just let Umbrella operate, they were Umbrella's biggest client. They had been buying the company's biological nightmares for years. If Umbrella fell too quickly, they were taking the presidency down with them. Behind the scenes, the crackdown was a performance, a desperate attempt to buy time and scrub their own fingerprints off the research. But you can't just bury a fire that's already spread. Survivors like Jill Valentine and Claire Redfield basically went off the grid, and they definitely weren't planning on just letting things go. Leon didn't exactly join the government by choice, they pretty much forced his hand. They used Sherry as leverage to keep him in line, basically making sure he stayed under their thumb. A few months in, the disaster turned into a massive legal headache. What everyone thought was just a conspiracy theory became a huge global investigation, which led to the Raccoon Trials. It was basically a 5-year-long fight to actually hold Umbrella responsible for wiping a city off the map. But Umbrella wasn't just gonna roll over. Since there was almost no physical evidence left after the blast, the company became experts at dragging things out and lying. In court, they would deny everything, point fingers, leak fake documents suggesting the virus was actually a government experiment that went wrong. And the tricky part was that they weren't entirely lying. The US government was so scared of their own secrets getting out that the prosecution basically hit a wall. For years, the whole case just sat there in a stalemate of classified files and lost evidence. While the lawyers were arguing, Umbrella just moved their shady businesses overseas to places like Russia, where nobody was watching them. For them, Raccoon City was just a way to collect data to make their next set of weapons even better. But people were still digging into them from the inside. Leon was now basically a tool for the government, working in the shadows to track Umbrella's shipments and clean up biohazard leaks. On the outside, Alyssa Ashcroft was becoming Umbrella's worst nightmare. As a reporter, she was proving that Umbrella was building weapons on purpose. She started finding threads of something way deeper than just a greedy company. Hints of a history that went back way before Umbrella was even a thing. Her stories were the first to suggest that Raccoon City might have been a controlled burn to hide a much older secret. And then there were people like Yoko Suzuki, who actually worked there. She provided the technical proof that Umbrella's medical research was just a front for something much darker. After 5 years of getting squeezed from every side, things finally started to fall apart for them. By 2003, Umbrella was finally done for. It started with a leak of a massive amount of data from their last stronghold in Russia, which was handed over to the prosecution. It was basically the entire Umbrella archive, everything their digital records had been hiding, the experiments, the bribes, and the actual proof of what happened in Raccoon City. When the verdict came back, Umbrella was found guilty of crimes against humanity. By the end of the year, the whole company was bankrupt after its stocks crashed. But the company going under didn't actually make the world safer, it just made things more messy. When the company was dissolved, all that research and virus data got sold off. Former researchers started working for whoever had the most money, and bioweapons started popping up on the black market all over the world. This caused the formation of the BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, to try and clean up the mess Umbrella left behind. It looked like a fresh start, but the same people who were secretly funding Umbrella were already moving into this new system, just waiting for the right time to make their next move. And the people who had survived the outbreak had lived, but they were still and would always be a part of Raccoon City, just as a part of Raccoon City would always live within them. It was in their minds and in their blood. They weren't free of this curse yet.